Next, we have a secretary department. Next, I would like to request our Honorable Sikyom Pembetrin Lal to address our staff members and the students.
Okay. Now, my idea at this time was to have a more interactive session with the senior students, including the Indian students, if they want to know more about our situation and where we are. I thought that would be more useful. But continuing with what our principal had said, when we first came into exile in 1959, His Holiness crossed over the Indian boundary on March 31st, 1959. And after having gone to Tezpur and other places, then His Holiness moved here in Mussoorie for 1 year, till 1st of May 1960. That was the day His Holiness Dalai Lama left Mussoorie on 31st, I think, 30th April, and 1st of May His Holiness reached Dharamsala. And since then, the Central Tibetan Administration, or some others call it Tibetan Government in Exile, has been located in Dharamsala for the last 62 years. Okay? And when we came into exile, we never thought that we will have to live in exile for this long. It has already been 63 years. And when we first came in 1959, our people have never, not many Tibetan people have been to India, even though our language came from India. As now you are studying in Tibetan school, so if you look at the alphabets, it's Tibetan alphabets are ka, kha, kha, nga, cha, 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 nya, ta, 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 na, pa, 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 ma, cha, san, za, wa. So very similar to Hindi. In Hindi you have a g extra, you know, out of the four or five syllables. And you have more vowels in Hindi, a, e, u, e, o, aha, something like that I learned during my class 6, 7. This is all I remember now, maybe not the complete thing, but we have only 4 vowels. So the Tibetan script was derived from an Indian script called the Devanagari script. And it was picked up from Kashmir at that time in 7th century AD, when the Tibetan emperor sent his minister and some more students to learn Tibetan. And that was the time we invented the Tibetan script. Okay? And in 8th century, we must have had the largest transliteration house in the world, because we translated every single Sanskrit Buddhist text into Tibetan language. And that was the advice given by Shantarakshita, the first Buddhist Indian teacher to have come to Tibet way back in 8th century. And he told the Tibetan emperor, since you already have a language, instead of me teaching you an Indian language, whether it's Pali or Sanskrit, it's better for you to translate all the Buddhist texts into Tibetan. And that is how we translated all the Buddhist texts from Sanskrit into Tibetan. And today, in this whole world, we are a repository of one of the ancient Indian wisdom. Okay? So even though we may look Tibetan, but mentally we are all the same, because our language came from India, our religion came from India. You know, the Buddhism went to China before it came to Tibet in 3rd century. So there was influence of Chinese Buddhism in Tibet in 8th century, and there was also the influence of Indian Buddhists in Tibet. And there was a debate held between a Chinese master and a Tibetan master, an Indian master who was a disciple of Shantarakshita called Vikramashila. So Vikramashila and this Chinese master had a debate, and then the Tibetan emperor decided that we'll go for Indian Buddhism instead of Indian Buddhism that went to China and came to Tibet. So since then, from 8th century, we have been following Buddhism. Okay? So we share similar roots in terms of thinking, because how you think is dictated by what you believe in, and particularly spirituality. Right? Okay, so with that, when we came in 1959 to India, our people had not been to India. They are not used to Indian food. They are not used to Indian weather. So many children died because of diet problems and weather problems. And later we were all put up in the foothills of Himalayas because our people had no knowledge or no skill whatsoever. The only thing we could do was hard labor. So the roads that you see in Chamba, in Dalhousie, in Manali area, in Shimla area, in Bomdila area, most of those roads in the Himalayas were built by the Tibetans initially, engaged by the Indian government. Okay? So because of the foresightedness of His Holiness, because at that time no Tibetans thought that we will have to live in exile for 63 years as of today. Right? We all thought that we'll go back to Tibet in 2-3 years' time, because the 13th Dalai Lama, when he had to come into exile in 1910 to India, he returned back in 2 years. And everybody expected that we would go back pretty soon. But now it has resulted in 63 years of exile. And we had to face so many challenges. We overcame those challenges, and today the Tibetan exile community is very unique in the world. There are no other exile communities who are as organized as we are. So in the exile administration that we have in Dharamsala, we have all the 3 pillars of democracy, whether it's the parliament that legislates, or the judiciary that adjudicates, or the executive that carry out all the programs and policies laid down by the parliament. And then we also have the 3 independent bodies of election, because the elections has to be held fairly. And we also have Public Service Commission, so you have to go through all kinds of exams to get to the civil service. That's a Tibetan public civil service, not the Indian public service, for which you have to go to this academy once you get selected, right? And then we also have Auditor General's office, so we hardly have any cases of corruption. I also joke with our friends that we don't have enough money for corruption also, right? So in that sense, we are a unique establishment. We are peculiar to some, and the democracy that we follow is a combination of both the presidential and the parliamentary system, because the election of Sigong has to happen in more than 20 different countries, because now Tibetans are spread in more than 20 different countries. And it's not easy, because we are the only partyless democracy in the world. We don't have political parties. So this is something that Acharya Vinoba Bhaveji had written as an ideology, but nobody had practiced that. We are the only one who is practicing it. So you don't have ruling party or opposition party. We don't have territorial constituencies. So these are some of the uniqueness or peculiarities as you see it. But we have developed our own uniqueness based on the circumstances that we are in and the conditions that also force us to take certain decisions. But all in all, I can say that we have achieved much more than many other exile communities, mainly because of the leadership of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. Right? So I'll stop here, and then if you have any questions, because the program says that we have to take a picture before the program ends, and I'm afraid by the time program ends, it'll be already dark. So I'll stop here. If you have any questions, I'll be very happy to respond from the Tibetan students or Indian students, it doesn't matter. Okay? Now the job of this school, not just this school, because this used to be the first school after coming into exile 50 students were selected, all kids with running nose and torn cloth were brought up from here, and later all these people became responsible people within the administration. Today they are very old. I know some of them. They are all quite old, and now you are following in their footsteps. And for us, it doesn't matter whether the students are Indian or Tibetan, because the boundaries are created by human beings. Right? What matters is future for all of you, right? And keeping that in mind, I would also advise the teachers also to follow that kind of thinking, not to differentiate between students, and I hope it doesn't happen now. But you will also, since you are studying in a Tibetan school, you will also have more access to issues that concerns the Tibetans. So in future, when you take up more important responsibilities in the community, then you can also think about helping us. Because we are refugees, right? We are refugees, but we are providing education to more than 6,000 Indian children. That's including the Himalayan children. And in the monasteries, we have about 288 monasteries that are registered with the Department of Religion and Culture. And the number is about 42,000 monks, nuns, and tantric practitioners. And that number has not decreased over the years. But what has decreased over the year is the total number of Tibetans in these monastic institutions. So as of today, there are only 33% Tibetans out of 42,000, which means it's only about 14,000 Tibetans in the monastic institutions. The rest of the 66% are Indians. So we are refugees, but we are also providing education to the Indian citizens on religion. Okay, if you add up both these numbers, 28,000 plus some 6,000 Indian students in schools, then we are educating more than 33,000 Indian students in our monastic as well as educational institutions. So the Indian government is helping us in running the Sambodha sets of schools, but other schools like the Homes Foundation, the Tibetan Children's Villages, they have to make their ends meet by reaching out to donors and sponsors. Even for you, it's not just the expense from the Indian government. The principal talked about some of the projects that you have here. Those are funded by the Sambodha set of schools or from the education department. So there are a lot more additional inputs from our administration apart from what the government of India provides. Okay? So I hope it helps all of you, and you should have this sense of brotherhood or sisterhood amongst the children and learn from each other, because this is a unique experience for you, Indian students, because no other Indian students get this opportunity to study with other Tibetan children and get to know about Tibet, because knowing about Tibet does not concern only the Tibetans. It is India's security. There are so many things that we keep discussing with the Indian government on many other issues, and it will definitely help you if you know more. Any knowledge over and above what you always learn is always beneficial in your life. It will come to you some way or the other. Okay? Okay, let's open the floor for questions and comments. Don't look at each other. Yeah, from the teachers also, if you have any questions that concerns you, you're always free to ask. Inda, who's going to be the icebreaker? Yeah, please. Make it informal. Covered beach, much I'm there. You have one here. Okay.
Hello. Good evening, sir. I'm Arishna from class 12C. And my question is, as we all know that Tibetans have come from China from refugee, means Tibet from refugee. But the main question is that what is happening on the ground level to get the lands back? Because about this Tibetan free Tibet movement, there is not much activity on the internet as well. So, what is actually happening?
Okay. Now, inside Tibet, I keep telling the international community, please take a seat. I keep telling the international community that we are dying a slow death. We are like being poisoned slowly, and dying a slow death. So when I say slow death, we're not just talking about the life of people inside Tibet. We are talking about the very identity of the Tibetans. So when we talk about the identity of the Tibetans, then it concerns the Tibetan language. Because Tibetan language, even if it's derived from Devanagari script, is very rich. So just recently, one of the monks in Dharamsala published a 223 volumes of Tibetan dictionary. Just dictionary, 223 volumes. And that itself is testament to the richness of Tibetan language, right? And since Buddhism is also rooted in the Tibetan language, because we studied Buddhism from Tibetan language, the Chinese government at present, under President Xi Jinping, follows this policy called one nation, one culture, one language. Now, if this is something, such kind of policy is implemented in India, you will have serious problem, because India is full of diversity. You know, so many regions, so many languages, so many cultures. But the whole world is embracing multiculturalism. You know, different cultures coming together, melting pots like the United States, and you have very good examples in federal setups with multiculturalism in Canada or Belgium or any other countries, because people are going from places to places and mixing up. But China is the only country that wants to go on a different path. You know, consolidate its own identity, the Han Chinese identity, because there is always, I was told about academic discourses in China as to who is a real Chinese, whether it's the Han Chinese, are the Manchus Chinese, are the Tibetans Chinese, are the Mongols Chinese, or not, because now many of these areas are conquered by China and ruled by China. Now, if Mongolia is part of China, let us say if the Mongolians are Chinese, then the Chinese can claim half of the world, because Genghis Khan invaded half of the world, you know. So those discourses will keep on going, but right now, under President Xi Jinping, more than 78% of the Tibetan children are put in colonial boarding schools, away from their family, away from their languages, away from their culture. So this is going to be very, very detrimental for the Tibetans in the next 1 or 2 decades. If this policy is pursued by the Xi Jinping government in his 3rd term, and that might follow into his 4th time also, then we will land up in serious problems. At one time, I used to fear demographic aggression from Chinese side, because they are 1.4 billion and we are only 6 million inside Tibet. And when I explain about Tibet to smaller children, I tell them that in our prayers we say Kangri Rabe Kobe Shingham Jong. So that's the heavenly abode surrounded by snow mountain ranges. So Tibet is surrounded by snow mountain ranges from all sides. You can see from the south the Himalayas that we share with India and Nepal and Bhutan. And we have more than 3,600 kilometers of border with India, which is still called as Indo-Tibetan Border Police and Border Force, not Indo-China Border Force or Indo-China Border Police. Indian government still has kept the same name. Like that. So this is one of the major problems for Tibet, right? The demographic aggression did not happen as much as we feared, because looking at the numbers from 2020 China's demographic survey, census, we do know that there has been increase of Chinese population in Tibet, but not as much as we expected that to be. Also because Chinese population itself is going down, because they followed this one China policy for too long, one child policy for too long, and now they have reversed this policy, but still the aging population is growing and the younger population is not enough for the economic development that they are looking for. In fact, India right now is in a better position because India has a lot more younger generations who will be the major labor force for India's economic development in the years to come. Okay? So this is one big issue. So when you point that out to the Chinese government, they point fingers at the United States and say, how did you treat your native people? Or Canadians say, how did you treat your First Nation people? Or the Australians to say, how did you treat your Aborigines? Or the New Zealanders with Maoris? Or even in Sweden, just last month I was there in Sweden, and Sweden doesn't have a very bad track record of having treated the natives badly, but even there China was pointing fingers. So what does that mean? That means that China knows that what the Americans did, Canadians did, Australians did was wrong. But the Australians and Canadians and the US people are making up for the wrongs that they did by their predecessors, by their forefathers. But China is doing exactly the same thing to the Tibetans right now. And when I define Tibet to the children, I tell them the Westerners started calling Tibet the roof of the world. I saw one book called Tibet Outpost, printed in 1906, where one of the chapters was called the roof of the world. And they called Tibet the roof of the world because of its altitude. So last month I was in Japan. I was telling the Japanese students, your highest mountain in Japan, the Mount Fuji, is like base camp in Tibet. Because that's only about 3,700, 800 meters above sea level, which is equal to about 12,000 feet above sea level. And 12,000 feet is the average altitude in Tibet, right? And then Asians call Tibet as the water tower of Asia. Why? Because the rivers that originate from Tibet goes into India and Pakistan in the form of Indus. The Ganges also flows from the boundary between Tibet and India. Then you have some rivers going into Nepal. Then some rivers like the Brahmaputra coming into India and Bangladesh. Then the Irrawaddy going into Burma. Then the Mekong going into Laos, Cambodia, Burma, Thailand and Vietnam. And the two lifelines of China, the Yalu and the Yangtze, also originate from Tibet. And Yalu is the cradle of Chinese civilization, right? That's why people call Tibet as the water tower of Asia. It's like the water tank. And China uses the water tank as a water tap. When there is more excess of water, they let it flow in the downstream countries, so you have flood. And when they are short of water, they put the tap off. So they use this. And some people say that about 1.8 billion out of the 7 billion people in this world have something directly or indirectly, their livelihood is related to rivers that originate from Tibet. And all the names of countries that I mentioned to you just now, from Pakistan to India to Bangladesh to Burma, Cambodia, Laos, Vietnam and China, all these are the most densely populated areas in the world, right? And these areas are also the food basket of Asia. And next, people say that Third World War could happen because of water, because water is becoming a more scarce commodity, right? Today, no one, before you, when you were kids, and when we were a little older, none of us thought that we will have to carry mineral water bottle with us. We always thought that we could drink water from anywhere. Now, water has been spoiled. So you need mineral water and pure drinking water for your good health, right? And even now, it's unimaginable for us to think about carrying oxygen on our back. But that day might also come if the pollution level goes up a lot. So we tell the world, today we are political refugees. Tomorrow there could be many more environmental refugees if Tibet's environment is not cared for, right? And the Chinese environmental scientists call Tibet the third pole. Have you heard of that? No. So which are the other poles? North Pole and South Pole. Who answered that? Oh, okay, you did. So North Pole, South Pole and Tibet Pole. Because of the Tibet's altitude and because of the amounts of glaciers and permafrost in Tibet that feeds all these major rivers, That's why Tibet is called as the third pole. So we urge Indian environmentalists also to raise their voice against the Chinese government, because Chinese government does not share any hydrological data with any of the downstream countries. And this is very dangerous. Okay? Then another issue is religious freedom. Now, Chinese government wants to be responsible for reincarnation, for the recognition of reincarnation of lamas, right? And to believe in reincarnation, first you should believe in religion. Because Chinese government is a communist government that does not believe in any religion. But at the same time, they want to be responsible for next life of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, Panchen Lama, or any other high lamas, because they want to use it for political purposes. Okay? So, His Holiness jokingly says, if Chinese government is really serious about reincarnation, they should study Tibetan Buddhism first, because reincarnation is very unique to Tibetan Buddhism. There are many other Buddhist countries, both Theravada and Mahayana, but His Holiness does not like to use this word Mahayana and Theravada. He prefers the word Sanskrit tradition and Pali tradition, because Pali used to be the language of the ordinary people during Buddha's time, and then Sanskrit used to be the language of the elite. So the Buddha also taught Buddhism at different levels of people with different mental disposition. Okay? So these are, and then His Holiness also in jest says that if Chinese government is really serious about reincarnations, then they should look for Mao Zedong's reincarnation first, because Mao Zedong died in 76. Then maybe Jiang Zemin, and then maybe the Dalai Lamas. You didn't understand the joke. Yeah. Nobody is smiling or nobody is laughing. So it's more like I'm speaking to a wall. Yeah. Oh, this is what His Holiness always has some very interesting side to his answers. You know, he always uses wisdom in responding to these questions. So these are some of the environmental, human rights, the issues related to Tibetan identity that concerns us right now in Tibet. And I don't know, is there any one of you who have read George Orwell's book, 1984? Have you heard of George Orwell? No. So you should find out this book and read this book, 1984, by George Orwell, written way back in 1959 or so. And George Orwell talks about a dystopian society where everything is controlled by the state. And his was a fictional story based on his imagination of what the world would turn out to be in 1959. And looking into the future in 1984, it did not happen in 1984, but this time, as of today, as we speak today in 2022, Chinese government is doing the same thing to create a dystopian society, where the state controls everything, including movement of people, with electronic surveillance, facial recognition, and they use very high level of artificial intelligence and controlling people, including collecting DNA samples from Tibetan people. They have already collected 1 million plus DNA samples from Tibetans. I don't know to what level they're going to use, but when they explain about why they are doing this, they say that it's for social security and for social control and security measures. So this is the level of control that we are talking about, and that is the reason why you have this term called the Orwellian gridlock system. So that's based on George Orwell's book. Unless you read that book, you won't understand this expression, Orwellian gridlock system. Suppose if you live in rural area, I live in the capital, and if you want to come to the capital, either you live with me as a friend or you have to live in a hotel, right? If you live in a hotel, they can track you anywhere through the electronic identification that you have. But if I live with you, and if I commit a crime, or from the Chinese government's perspective, if I commit something, then all your family will also suffer. So I have to think many times before I commit something. Now, even in the case of self-immolation, 158 Tibetans have self-immolated so far. inside Tibet, hoping against hope that the Chinese government will pay some attention to their plight, or hoping against hope that the international community might pay some attention to their plight. But unfortunately, nothing has come out. Now, today in Tibet, if I want to burn myself, it's not like the Tibetans cannot commit violence. Tibetans, if they want, they can kill some Chinese, but they are not doing that, because this goes against the Buddha Dharma, right? So there is this very thin line, which is decided by the motivation that prompts you to take certain action, right? And for the motivation of the well-being of all the 6 million Tibetans, you sacrifice your own life. But today, if I have to think about burning myself, I might die or I might be scarred for life. But I have to think about my immediate family who could suffer because of my action. That is the gridlock system. So if you are caught sending out any information from inside Tibet, you have to go to jail. There's no choice, right? And if you receive any information, if you are inside Tibet, if I send some information to inside Tibet, if you receive and don't redistribute it, still you are okay. But if you are found redistributing, you land up in serious trouble. So that is the level of control we are talking about. So you should enjoy your freedom here in India. You know, you should cherish this freedom, because freedom doesn't come easy. And once you lose it, it's very difficult to gain. And your predecessors, your forefathers have gone through this under British occupation. And how many people had to sacrifice their life to gain freedom for India? So you cannot take freedom for granted. Russia, when I go to Europe these days, Europeans tell me, oh, we have not been able to read the writing on the wall because Putin has been saying that from 2014, after they invaded Crimea, they said next is Ukraine. But nobody believed Putin. But now Putin has invaded Ukraine, and war is very much in the face of Europe. Right? Till problem is right on your doorstep, you don't realize. Once it's on your doorstep, then only you realize the value of that freedom. So freedom has to be protected at all costs, at any time. You cannot take it for granted, never ever. Okay? But also cherish the freedom. The freedom does not necessarily mean to say that you can do whatever you want. But there are also sets of responsibilities that comes with the rights that you enjoy. Okay? Yeah. Any other question?
Thank you, sir.
So I normally say when there are no questions, it either means one or the two, right? One? Okay. That's why when somebody gets up to ask questions, everybody claps. I was telling the same thing to Tibetan Homes Foundation, because there are too less people who ask questions, so you find questioners very valuable that you have to clap all the time. Please.
Good evening, sir. First of all, I would like to thank the school for giving one wonderful opportunity to interact with the Tibetan president of Sikkim, Tibettv. My name is Kumar Chu, and I'm class 12 science. Sir, you have seen that most of the students in school are from Himalayan region. So Himalayan region, after the class 10 pass out, and class 12, we Himalayan student does not have any scholarship from the Tibetan side. If we have a scholarship, then we get some background support to achieve our ambition. So why we don't have any scholarship, especially for this Himalayan region, yeah, sir? Like Ladakh, Arunachal Pradesh, and Shimla. So why?
That you should ask your state governments as to why they are not doing it for you. So you should.
Tibetan side, sir. You are studying right in Tibetan school.
But that doesn't matter, no? That doesn't matter, because you are Indian citizens. Right? Whether you are going to a Tibetan school or whether you are going to an Indian school, it should not matter. Your government, who is supposed to take care of you. So if it is Ladakh students, it has to be taken care of by the Ladakh government. That's why I keep telling Ladakh Hill Council. Earlier, when Ladakh was part of Jammu Kashmir, they didn't have much budget. Now they are receiving more than what they could spend. So even that's why you should listen to my talk, what I said before also, no? We are refugees. When I go to foreign countries, I go with both my hands stretched. One for political support and one for monetary support. We have no taxation. Whatever Tibetans contribute, as of today, how much the Tibetan contributes accounts for our total expenses. It's only about 9%. If we are spending 100 rupees, only 9 rupees come from the Tibetans. The rest of the 91% we have to beg all the time. And when we beg for the Tibetans, we are refugees, it's easier to get sponsorship. But when we beg for Spiti people or Bhutanese people or Nepalese people or Sikkimese or Arunachali, when they say they are from independent countries, how can we support independent countries, students from independent countries? Even now we feel shortage of funds. We have to keep begging all the time. So the onus of your education should be on the state governments. That's why we say at school level, we will provide the education if you are willing to study in a Tibetan school with the support of Indian government or without the support of the Indian government, or those funds we receive directly and we spend it on you. So beyond that, if we have to support, we need the money. We don't have the money. If we have money, then we can spend for everybody. Then it's not a problem. The resource is always a problem, both financial and human. So we are only 130,000 Tibetans in exile. India, Nepal and Bhutan about 80,000. Rest of the 50,000 Tibetans are elsewhere in Europe and North America and Far East countries. So for us, our main responsibility is to resolve the Sino-Tibet conflict, that is one thing, and the other is to look after the welfare of the Tibetans in exile. Now I have that many number of requests for funds, and we have to keep begging all the time. And I have to now relocate about 2,000 families with about 5,000 people who doesn't have any homes. Tibetans who came from Tibet in the 80s, 90s and 2000s were not provided with any land by the Indian government. So we have to relocate them in the compact communities. And for that alone, even if we don't pay them full amount, even on a cost-sharing basis, I have to gather about minimum $15 million US. And where will we get that money from? So we have a lot of constraints. At the school level, we are trying to do as much as we can. But at the larger level, when you go to universities, then it has to be your government who should support you. Because you are from an independent country, right? We are refugees. Actually, we would be seeking more help. So it's not as if we are not worried about your higher education. Of course we are worried, but then we should also have the means to do that. For our own children also, we are not able to give them full scholarship. We are able to give only part scholarship, and the rest they have to find for themselves. And institutions like Tibetan Homes Foundation, they have to find their own scholarships all the time. Right. So if you understand the problem and the challenges that the exile community faces, then you won't be asking this question. So next time, put this question to your government. From which part did you say you are coming from?
Arunachal Pradesh.
Arunachal Pradesh. I'm going to Arunachal Pradesh from 1st onwards. But the Chief Minister is not going to be there, but I will definitely meet with some official functionaries there. I will tell them this is the kind of input I'm getting from your children. So it should be the responsibility of the Arunachal government to look after the welfare of the Arunachal students. And similarly, students from Sikkim or from Uttarakhand or from Himachal Pradesh or Ladakh should be the same. Okay?
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. So enough for one day. And next time, if I do manage to come, because I have to travel around the world and visit all the Tibetan settlements, so it's not possible for me to come again and again. That's why whenever I come, I make it a point to meet with the students The elderly generation now, their time is how much ever you teach them, it won't change them very much. But the younger generation, there is lot more hope. And for the Tibetans in this school, they have to be responsible in the future for the administration of the Tibetans. So they have to take our seat. That's why they have to put in all the energy. Not unlike the Indian students where you have independence of your country, you live in a free country. The Tibetans have an added responsibility because we are occupied by China. Okay? So that is one good thing, that we are all studying together and we all help each other now and into the future. Okay? And this is what we always teach, altruism, to help others in Tibetan schools, which is also the values that the Indian Puranics and Indian ancient wisdom also espouses. Okay? Yes, sir. Okay, so nice to meet you, and thank you for the opportunity for me to speak to you and interact with you in as little time as possible. But I hope it did help you to understand our cause and our situation better. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for our Honorable Sijona, for your kind words and about the Tibet and the Tibetans, and especially for the students who participated in the interactive session. Thank you so much. Now, last we have our school headmistress. So I would like to request our school headmistress to say a word of thanks. Good evening, everyone. Honorable Sikyong Pembasingla, Sir Jigme Nangila, Education Secretary, Department of Education, Sir Tunduk Kalpula, Tibetan Settlement Officer of Tikiling. I, on behalf of all the students and staff of Sabara Tibetan School Basuri, I would like to thank you for your kind visit and investing your precious time on us. And also I would like to especially thank our Honorable Sikyong Pembasingla for enlightening our dear students with the history of our rich Tibetan culture and language, and also the uniqueness of Tibetan government in exile. And I also like to thank you, sir, for attending queries raised by the students. Thank you, sir. Thank you one and all.
Before I go, I just want to make one point. Since we have a religious teacher here, you should not think that we are trying to change into Buddhists. This is never the case. Okay? But if there is anything that you can learn from him, is logic. And that has no religion. Okay? Logic has no religion. So there are also aspects of Buddhist science that you can study. Okay? Forget about, don't touch the ritual part. Rituals will be done by practitioners. You know, Hindu rituals will be followed by Hindu practitioners. Similarly with Buddhists, same thing. But what the wisdom that Germche will have is to teach you logic, because logic can be applied to anything. Okay? Thank you. That's hard.